Welcome back to the podcast. We're in the middle of April now, and there's something that's on my mind. This is a time of year. There are these seasons during the year where school owners think about certain things. There's recital season, there's the fall rush. We've talked ad nauseum on this podcast about the fact that, you need to start preparing for summer camps in December through February. Like, that's the best time to really get that going. And Nate and I even did an episode a while back where Nate even talked about the fact that, Nate, don't you start your summer camp prep like in the fall of the previous year?
Yeah, well, I was just talking to Pierre, our camp director, yesterday, and she said, actually, summer camp is a 12-month-a-year project. And we do our, I say September is quiet. October, we do a post-mortem on the last summer. And by November, we're already working on that curriculum and thinking ahead.
Yeah. So just these seasons. So this season right now is when a lot of school owners start thinking about their fall programming. Obviously, the summer's looming, but when people are considering what are we going to do in the fall, this is the time of year. And I've seen that in a variety of ways. And so we wanted to bring Greg back because there is something that I've noticed more than ever in the last 12 to 15 months and talking to a lot of owners of schools that are like 200 kids, 400 kids, 600 kids. Not so much smaller studios, but larger schools. There's this, I don't know if it's a trend. It's just something I've never noticed before. And it's this hesitation to use what I think is one of the most powerful structures that a school can use. And I'm just going to tell a few brief stories. And again, welcome to the podcast, Greg. I'm glad you're back. You're a friend of the show. You come back when we need you most. So I do just want to take a moment to say welcome, right?
Yes. Hello. It is good to be here.
Cool. So Greg, I think, is uniquely positioned to speak to this, but there is like this story I want to just share here at the beginning because this is why this topic is so heavy on my mind. And I think so many schools could benefit from what we're talking about right now. Like, this is the right place, the right time. So I'm going to tell just two very brief stories here. In the last year, I've talked to two owners in particular where they have built a truly unique and massive school. Hundreds and hundreds of students, multi-discipline, has the respect of the community, great teacher retention, these sorts of things. And the owner personally is taking home less than what I made as a solo teacher, like the second or third year that I was teaching. I've looked at their balance sheets. I have looked for ways to optimize, and the lever that's just the easiest to pull to help the owner experience better margins and to be able to stop working crazy hours. The lever to pull, just so obviously to me, is a structure that, I think I've kind of come to be known for, like this group lesson structure. So why is it that there is this obvious structure that would be of benefit to school owners, but mid-size and larger school owners are afraid to use that structure, except in cases of like, oh, it's a fringe program on the side. Like, oh, we have like a preschool program where kids meet in groups, or we have like this piano club, or we have this program where kids play in ensembles, but only like 0.5% of our school is enrolled in it. And it's actually also an extra. It doesn't replace their private lesson. Why is that? And so I've actually gone on a little personal mission in the last 6 months of asking owners who are not using that structure or are using it in a small way, why that they're not using it. And I found a couple reasons as to why. But I think Greg, the reason I wanted to bring you back, Greg, was you are such a good example of how a school can run so efficiently and avoid a lot of headaches that larger studios experience, yet you yourself are a mid-sized to larger studio. So anyway, that's quite a setup. I'm going to stop talking now. Where would be a good place to start this, do you think, Nate? Should we maybe talk about some of those reasons why folks are hesitant to use the group structure? Or maybe we should just jump into what I'll call the benefits of using that structure. Do we go on the negative end or do we start on the positive end? What do you think?
I think I love this, the way you teed it up around resistance. I'd love to hear from Greg just right out of the gate. Like, why do you think owners have resistance in the first place to what appears to both Daniel and myself as a really obvious next step to try to improve margins? I'm just curious, Greg, in your experience.
Well, I think that first of all, change is difficult. If you don't have a group lesson program or a thriving, committed group lesson program in your studio, just the change that it would take, you'd have to restructure your rooms and your schedule, and you have to introduce a new program to families. And there's the fear that the families that you work with are going to not like the change any more than you do. And there is also, I think there is still, I'm going to use the word, a stigma with group lessons. And I think it comes mostly from people who have never experienced group lessons, or people who have never tried to teach extensively with group lessons, people who are on the outside looking in. There's that old saying, you don't knock it till you try it. There's a lot of people that are knocking it who have never tried it. And so there's this, I think the resistance comes from maybe false belief and maybe fear of change.
Yeah, Greg, one of the things I love about your story is that you're someone who started, obviously you were teaching privately at some point in your career as an educator, but when you started Piano Express, my understanding is that you just went all in on this idea of groups. And so for you, you've just been developing essentially the answer to all opposition around groups, because you've been committed since the beginning. And I really love this idea. It's what are families saying to you that what objections do they have that you're now have worked out? Maybe you could give us 1 to 3 right out of the gate before we dive in further. Just common objections from parents. Maybe it's just also so our listeners who are about to press stop and nope, I have too much resistance to this. You can just help them right out of the gate. Be no. Here are common objections, and I've got answers for you.
Right. Well, I'm an extremely pragmatic person, so I believe in things that work, and I am very opposed to things that don't work. And I judge everything by results. And so if you have students that can master their instrument and play with excellence, then you have a journey that you're taking them on that works. And if that journey is also beneficial to your business, it's beneficial to your school, it's beneficial to your lifestyle, it's beneficial to your core staff, all these things that we're going to talk about today, it's beneficial to your own personal commitment to excellence, then why would you take a longer, harder road to get to essentially the same place?
Yeah. And I would just say that some of the things that Greg mentioned there, 100%, that's what I've heard from owners. I've also heard resistance points around the idea of, well, we've built up this massive private lesson program. We have 15 teachers, we have 12 teachers, we have 23 teachers. If I switch to this now, I'm going to have to let most of these teachers go. There's resistance around feelings of loyalty to staff. There's resistance around, we've built to this level using the structure we have. Why would we rock the boat now? Things are working. Why would we rock the boat? Those are two big ones that I've heard as well, along with the I think the biggest one, which is just a fear of change, but a fear of change particularly around not just the staff, but, what will my current customers think of this? And I'll say that, and this could be a topic for another podcast, it doesn't have to be current customers that experience this new program. You can start small. But I do think to identify where we're running from can be helpful, and that's kind of what we've been doing here. But identifying where we're going to, I think, is why I wanted Greg on here, because I think Greg, in all the years I've known him, has just articulated so well, the benefits of this structure, and has kind of seen that in his own studio. I would just say before you kind of jump into what those benefits are, because we're just going to jump into it here. We're not going to prolong this. I would say just before we jump into that, Nate, has there been any resistance points that you've experienced over the years around introducing group instruction to the core skill building in the school? Because I know you do a lot of group around rock bands and things of that nature, but I do know that your private lesson program is actually pretty huge. Do you resonate with any of those things I said? Is there anything you can add that maybe I didn't say there? I'm curious.
I just think, so most of our group classes are focused around songwriting and developing songwriters, and specifically helping them learn how to collaborate with others, right? So it's fairly obvious to everyone listening, if you want to develop collaboration, back to what you said, Greg, if that's your definition of excellence, is that you're becoming more and more comfortable in a collaborative setting, well, then you have to set up them in a group so that they can work on developing the skills to collaborate. I think where we find resistance over the years has been primarily in parents wondering if their child is going to get the necessary attention that they deserve. Or we will get resistance from families that, and even teachers that might say this child in particular needs a different type of attention than is available in a group setting. It's a little more detailed and in the weeds in terms of the type of resistance, but I'm going to just say outright, our school currently, its makeup is nearly 50% group classes, 50% private lessons. And if you include the camps, that's another like 800 enrollments a year just in camps. That's all group focused. Anyways, that's just another hell yes moment for those of you listening. Let's look towards how we can implement groups. And I want to just double down and highlight on one thing you said, Daniel, and then dig into many of the benefits, Greg, that you're going to touch on, which is absolutely don't think it's all or nothing. You don't need a camp of 800 to warrant a camp. You don't need a group class of 150 enrollments to warrant group classes. Like you said, Daniel, you can start small, because even starting small, you're going to find much better margins. If I told you right out of the gate, the cost of labor differential between private lessons and group classes, which I'm sure is one of the things you're going to touch on, Greg, but our cost of labor for group classes is something like 18% to 19%. Our cost of labor for private lessons is in the 30 percentile, right? So just that alone is worth considering group classes.
Yes, and I would be remiss not to jump in here and say that calculating the benefit that a group structure can have for your school is something that, Greg definitely thinks about. It's something I've definitely thought about, and I would invite anyone, I'd be remiss not to mention, you should definitely go over to grouplessons.com and go to the pricing page. We have a calculator there where you can actually put in the current statistics, enrollment statistics, and other important information from your school into this calculator. It can actually do that math for you based on a couple models that we created around group lessons and how those margin differences can look. And it's a really powerful calculator. We spent a good amount of time kind of programming it. And definitely check out grouplessons.com/pricing, and you can run that math for yourself. It's actually shocking. I've shown it to people before, and I think intellectually we all understand that, but when you actually see it on paper, like, without even adding any more students, we could have this margin instead of that margin. That's the difference between saving for retirement or not. That's the difference for being able to fund an HSA or not. That's the difference for being able to hire an admin or not. Like it's actually very, very powerful. So definitely check that out over on grouplessons.com. But Greg, let's get into that main list. I know over the years, I think I've counted like 6 or 7 benefits that you have really latched onto, or that I've heard you talk about a lot, but there were 3 big ones I think you wanted to share with us today. What's that first one?
Well, I want to talk about things that you wouldn't expect, right? It kind of hits you in the face that there's the cost, right? You're going to save on staff costs. Your revenue per hour, per minute, per second is going to be better. But I wanted to talk about the things that are a little bit less obvious. I've been teaching group lessons for years and years, and so I have been surprised by a few things that I didn't expect, and that's what I wanted to talk about today. But I do want to first talk about staff. Okay. Hiring staff is a huge stress for all studios. It's a stress for me. It is a stress for anyone that tries to manage staff, because you want good people on your team. You want like a strong core, but it's in many cases a very transient job. People come and they work for your studio for a few years and they move on, and then you're constantly rehiring, or it might not be a good fit and you might have to let someone go sooner, and so just the turnover of having to rehire. Teaching group lessons from the get-go, you do not need to hire as much staff. So as the pain point of constantly hiring and rehiring and turnover is not as painful. And I also want to say one of the hidden benefits with working with a smaller staff is you can be choosier with who you work with. Okay. Imagine like a baseball team. I know it's gearing up to baseball season. I grew up in Pittsburgh, so I'm a lifelong Pirates fan, even though they're pretty terrible these days. But when I was a kid, when I was a kid in the early 90s, the Pirates were a pretty good team. And we had a great outfield. Okay. We had in center field, we had a guy named Andy Vince-Like. In left field, we had a guy named Bobby Bonilla. And in right field, there was a guy you probably never heard of. His name was Barry Bonds. And, and so these guys, imagine if we just let those guys bat over and over and over, and the rest of the team never had to hit. Like our second baseman, his name was Jose Lind. He was a good defender, but he was terrible. Well, sorry, he was not that good at batting. So I'm sorry Jose Lind, if you see this podcast, you're like, wait, I made it to the major leagues. Are you kidding me? I batted 200 in the major leagues. 1 out of 5 at bats was a hit. Still below average. Okay, he was a below average batter. Our first base, third base, okay. Our catcher, not a good hitter. Imagine if we could just skip their at bats and just have the outfield bat over and over and over. The offense would score tons of runs every game. So it's the idea of shrinking down to a smaller core, and instead of needing to hire more people, you have just the people that are making you the strongest. Daniel has talked so much about marketing your studio so that you have more phone calls coming in than students that you need, so you can be choosy with your students, right? You market to the point where you need to turn some students away. That way you can increase the quality of your student base, right? So group lessons is just a really natural way to do that with your staff. For those of you listening to this podcast, you're working one-on-one lessons and you have a big staff, you're probably stressed about that. Transitioning to group lessons, and I've helped a lot of I've helped a lot of studios transition from one-on-one to group lessons. And it's like there's this pain point. Wait, I'm going to have to let some of the staff go. Even the staff that you kind of need to part ways with, I said it at the beginning of this podcast, change is difficult, even the good change. Okay. And I would say it's okay to take change slow if it involves, shrinking your staff. But the decisions that are made for the greater good, I can always say I've had to make some hard decisions in my career, and I've taken too long to make good decisions at times because they were just hard to make because it didn't feel good. And all I did is I dragged out a bad situation. And
that's huge.
And so as a leader, sometimes leaders have to make uncomfortable decisions. Leaders have to do the right thing, even when it doesn't feel happy. And so I would say, there is an opportunity gradually going from one-on-one lessons to group lessons to improve your staff situation. Go ahead, Daniel.
Yes. Okay. So much you're saying here. First off, that idea of making the tough decision. In reality, as the business owner, we are balancing a number of competing interests. And if you're a good leader, you're wanting to balance those interests fairly, and that's you're self-interested. You're interested in the benefits of your, in your staff. You're interested in the benefits that you can give to clients and the parents of your students and those sorts of things. But actually, the number one interest that you should have is actually on the health of the business itself. And a lot of times what I see owners doing, and in particular, one of the people that I was mentioning at the beginning, in the beginning story, is that they made sacrifices personally so that they didn't have to make hard choices that would have benefited the business. So in other words, they made sacrifices at their expense for other people, and they were decisions that were not best for the business and the business's growth. And it was out of a personal calculus. It was out of maybe a misplaced feeling of obligation towards other actors in the business. I see this so often. And unfortunately, a lot of times the way it's phrased is, I can't make that decision. That would be so selfish of me. It actually wouldn't most of the time. I think a lot of times when I hear that word being used, the people who are most concerned about being selfish are actually usually the ones who should be more selfish most of the time. And I know that's a little bit far afield from what you were just talking about there, but that's how it often plays out psychologically and emotionally in this industry, is that decisions are made that avoid short-term emotional pain, but actually cause long-term loss or lack of growth in the business. So definitely what you said there resonated.
I was going to say a couple of things, then ping it back to you, Greg, with a follow-up question. Number one, there was a really important pivot point for us at Brooklyn Music Factory around this very topic of hard choices, especially as it pertains to people and benefits, salary and otherwise. And we went through a stage where we had to actually freeze everyone's salary or hourly. We had to go to them and say, listen, these are the choices we're making. We're not going to make a change in this for at least a couple of years. And here's the why. And I drew a pie on this, board and said, because here's what it costs of every dollar we spend, 88 cents to operate the company, which leaves 6 cents left over for the IRS and almost no cents left over for the owners or to invest back in the company. And it was just very transparent. And this was a really important pivot point that's linked to the topic today and around what you're saying, Greg, which is because that was a moment where we went from a state of ignorance to clarity in our financial awareness and fluency. So in addition to what, Daniel, you're talking about, dude, which is sometimes we're bringing our own heartfelt desire to be generous into the equation, which can actually put blinders on for us for the benefit of the company as a whole. That also needs to be coupled with whether or not you have clarity on the financial structure of your business. Getting back to your tee up at the open, Daniel, when you talk about owners that are actually having schools, maybe they have 400 or 500, 600 students in them, or 250 and students, and yet they're making less than a single teaching studio. They're bringing home less, putting cash. That means, in my experience working with school owners, that means that they actually are ignorant of the full picture. Actually don't understand even why they're not bringing that in. So it's a combination of sometimes we confuse our own personal with the ignorance of just not actually having that skill yet together for the company. If we don't have that skill yet together to make an informed choice, then it's very hard. Yeah, back to you, Greg, it feels even harder to make the tough choice because you don't even have the clarity yet on it, right? So there's an element of faith that comes in when you're listening to an episode like this and we're talking with an expert like Greg on it, where he's saying, we do take leaps of faith often. We just went through it. We're literally in a leap year. It's a great time to actually just trust. At times, it'd be like, hey, you know what? If I take this leap of faith, maybe I can couple that with understanding profit margins differently between group classes and one-on-ones and figuring out how to balance both of those. And by the way, Greg, your comment around your staff and knowing who's going to stay and who's going to leave, the truth is that's a universal, and people struggle with that because everybody who has a heart and wants to be generous and kind is always going to struggle with asking someone to leave, right? That's always going to be hard. It doesn't mean it's the wrong choice. Because Daniel, you're absolutely right that what we're doing is we're building an entity that can support our employees for in a sustainable, ongoing way for years to come. We do not want to create a business that we resent, that we will then eventually not even be able to afford that teacher we love anyways. Right, Greg? It's like we want to take care of those that we want to be around because we actually want a company for them to be around in.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a big believer where there's a will, there's a way, and so this is definitely not going to be a conversation of how do you fire your staff. I think that
we have those episodes.
If you have a staff that's valuable to you, you're going to keep. And if everyone on your staff is valuable and you want to keep them all, then start a group lesson program and build your student base and bring more money in and pay everybody more and keep everybody. There's for every situation, there's definitely a way to deal with it. But if you're in a situation where you have a big studio, some of your staff, they're strong players, and some of your staff you have this feeling that they might not be the perfect fit for your studio, there is an opportunity to get lean and strong in your core with your staff. So yeah, that is my first point.
Yeah, and I will just say, I remembered what I was going to say earlier. I think it's better as prelude, but maybe this could be a good way to conclude this point, and that is just that we have a number of marketing automations set up at Grow Your Music Studio and Seven Figure Music School podcast and all that sort of thing. And we have in one funnel just a place where people who might be new to knowing about the podcast, we give them an opportunity to leave a question or a challenge that they'd like us to do a podcast episode on. And I would say that over the period of time that has been in existence, I'm not kidding when I say this, the number one issue that I've seen, other than marketing, it could be tied with marketing, is I have trouble finding good teachers. That is the number one issue I see. This is that way to solve that problem. I just feel using a system like Piano Express or some group system, it gives you a structural advantage, it gives you a competitive advantage, it reduces the complexity, it reduces, I'm not going to say it puts things on easy mode, obviously not, it's business, but it certainly can make things better. I'll just maybe end my thought with that.
This episode is sponsored by BigMusicGames.com. As our listeners know, Brooklyn Music Factory is all about a fun, fluency-first approach to music lessons. And at the foundation of our teaching methods are rhythm, melody, harmony, and songwriting games that challenge students as young as 4 years old to train their ears and flex that musical mind. Because when you set an intention of gamifying every single lesson, you're going to find improved attendance, increased play at home, and higher student retention. So we've set up a website just for our listeners so you can start playing today. Go to bigmusicgames.com/7FMS and create your free account. Again, that's bigmusicgames.com/7FMS. And if you join today, I'm going to send you a personal invite to join our weekly teacher training call with me and Greg Genter, our chief game designer. Go ahead and put play back into practice with Big Music Games.
So, Greg, you said it's a staff solution. What's that next hidden benefit that you were wanting to talk about?
I want to talk about the teacher's lifestyle and professional development. You are offering your service to the community, to your students. And the more you invest in yourself, the better and higher quality your service can be. What you have to offer to your community is more refined, it's more focused. I'm going to tell you a story. When I was in college, I was an accompanist for many voice majors. I was a piano major that could sight read, and so I was in demand as an accompanist. And so a lot of voice majors wanted me to come to their voice lessons and learn the repertoire. So I got to sit in on a lot of voice lessons. I wouldn't say that I can sing opera right now, but I heard other people do it a lot. One of the professors was talking to her student, and she said, "Enjoy these years as a college student because this is the last time in your life that you'll get to practice." I was like, "What?" I was like in the corner of the room listening. I was like, "No, please, what? When I grow up, I'm gonna have no time to practice." I did not want to believe that was true. All right, let's fast forward. I started teaching piano. I was driving door to door. I was teaching all one-on-one lessons. My reputation started to grow in the community. A lot of people started calling, and it did take a while to get traction. Okay, I'm skipping a lot of the story. I went from 5 students to 10 students in like 9 months, but then from 10 to 40, in the next year. But I was driving door to door teaching. I had high schoolers before school, homeschoolers during school, after school students, and then adults. I had some days I was leaving the house at 7:30 in the morning, and I wasn't coming home until 9:30 at night. And I was married. My wife, we had our first baby, and I was still gone on some days 14 hours. And I'm just going to be completely honest, okay? I finally got a student all the way to Faber and Faber's level 3B, which is late elementary. And I thought that was like some kind of like mountaintop. And we were talking about 16th notes, right? And I wanted to demonstrate 16th notes. So I set the metronome, I kid you not, 69 beats a minute, and my fingers tangled up. And I was like, wait a minute, that's a fluke. Let me try again. And they tangled up again. And I was like, oh my gosh, that lady was right. I am not practicing and I'm losing my, like, it just hit me. Something had to change. There were a few moments in my life that put me to a breaking point where I realized that I could not keep doing what I was doing. And this was one. I was like, I cannot live a life where my own personal development is so neglected that I am losing my ability to offer a good service to my community. And so group lessons, let me fast forward 20 years real quick, because that was a long time ago. I can play 16th notes now. I got my Hannon book back. We should do a podcast on what everybody thinks of Hannon if we want sparks to fly.
Controversial.
But I...
At least in the piano teacher community.
Tuned into a podcast.
Right.
Yes. But anyways, personal development, making time not only to practice, but to attend meetings. To like, I'm now involved in NVMTA. I actually chair a few of their events. I volunteer with them. It's a great, like, that's my local chapter of MTNA. Whatever music teacher groups are in your community, network with them. Build. I mean, another podcast we could do is on networking, because that's huge. But it's all under the umbrella of personal development. Making time to invest in yourself. You cannot do that if you are running yourself into the ground with a schedule of one-on-one lessons sun up to sundown. And I know from experience what you get paid for teaching one-on-one lessons, especially if you're driving door to door. You to make ends meet, you kind of do have to run yourself into the ground. And so it's like a catch-22. It's like, do you want to have time to yourself and be in a real financial struggle, or do you want to make ends meet, provide for yourself if you have a family, provide for your family, but then have no time for personal development? Group lessons is a huge, like, open door to a better world. You know, you can work with all of your beginners together. You can group them up. You can teach students how to read notes and how to be note readers and get through that elementary phase. You can routinely get to students to that level 3B range, you know, that late elementary range, and still have time left over to invest in yourself. Keep the service that you offer to your community strong. Invest in your community of teachers, your network of teachers. You know, I encourage everyone listening to this podcast to get, you know, involved as a volunteer in some ways. Amazing things happen.
Nate, how does this resonate for you? Was this true for you in your school as well?
Absolutely. It's hard for me to I was just thinking as you were talking, Greg, I was like, wait, was I investing in the craft of business, which was actually freeing up time, which was allowing me to take better care of myself? Or was it around group programs versus private lesson programs? I'm sure it's a combination of all of the above.
Right.
Right.
There's a lot of different ways to crack an egg, right? So group lessons is one way to do it. But yeah, if you've done other ways, that's great.
Well, and no, what I was going to add to it too was that we're investing in ourselves, and that I've absolutely seen this to be true. The better I take care of myself, the better the business is run, period. You know, and the better the energy is within the business. And I would extend that actually to what you're saying. When you open a group program, like in our case, we're, you know, at Mini Keys and Jam Band 101 in our camps, you're actually re-engaging with the development of your teachers, right? And so that's a huge piece for us. If you, we say this oftentimes at the factory, like, if I feel like I need to have a life as a teacher and an educator that allows for me to maintain my craft as a player and also develop personally, then don't every other teacher at BMF need the same thing,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
right? And it's a very common move as you're growing your business to actually forget about everyone else, because you're sort of running around like a chicken with its head cut off for the first 5 to 7 years of your business, of your music school, trying to get it organized, right? And finally you figure out how to do it, and you start to find some space for yourself. And if that's the case, make sure that we remind ourselves, like Greg is saying, that if we need that development time, we want to be able to cut it with our 16th notes at 69 BPMs. Then obviously all the other teachers at your school, you want the same thing for them. So that's just another piece in that. It's another +1 on your group program, and creating higher margins where you can pay higher rates to them.
One of the mentors I had, his name was Tim. He talked about this. Maybe this is a good way to wrap up this particular section. He had this concept he called the Valley of Despair, where when you're making a change, you actually go through a temporary period where things get worse before they get better. And that certainly was true for me as I switched to a group model in my own studio, because temporarily it did feel harder because I was overturning something that worked to build something new. And I know in the cases where I've observed mid-size or larger schools that have a staff doing this, there is this period of time where it's like, oh, I got to retrain staff. I've got to reappropriate their usage of time. We've got to reappropriate usage of our floor space. In some cases, I've seen schools where they've actually had to do a little internal reconfiguration of where a wall is or things like that, all for that idea of a better future. But out of all those things, all the benefits, I think the one that gets slept on, as I was saying kind of at the beginning, but possibly is the most important one, is that you can't get back your time as a human. You can't get back your time. And so there's a lot of things that you can replace in life. You can't replace the time. And I just think, for my part, that, and I do really say this sincerely, the deep satisfaction I got after going through that hard period of kind of reconfiguring what had been working for me before, and then on the other side of that reconfiguration, as you said, the lifestyle benefits were huge. I'll just give one, and then I'll kick it back over to you guys, or Greg, if you want to talk about the third benefit, that's cool too. But early in my career, I hated taking days off. There was no good way to reschedule those kids. And I'll even admit this to my shame, very early on, like just out of college, when I was really struggling even to make ends meet, I would literally go to lessons sick because I could not afford to cancel lessons if I had a cold. Not the best thing to do. I say that sadly at this point. Once I had my group model in full swing, I went from I've made this joke, if I could have taught on Christmas Day, I would have. But I went from begrudgingly taking 2 weeks off at Christmas to I went to, the week before as well. And then the whole month of December. And then actually the Wednesday before Thanksgiving Day was my last day of teaching for the year. And then it went literally to just the middle of November. And I would take 6 weeks off at Christmas. Could not have done that without the group lesson structure. Could not have done it, period. And I realized that, each studio was a little bit different in the size of their school or what program they're running, et cetera, et cetera. But that was one really, that was such a refreshing and recharging time for me, that end of the year. And by the time that I got back into the teaching studio, the first week of January, I was ready to go. I was missing it. Whereas before it was 2 weeks off and then bam, you're right back in the studio. It was huge. So I think that's just a really poignant way that lifestyle solution that you're talking about, Greg, really showed up for me. So anyway, Greg, as we're kind of going into the final one here, you, like I said earlier, there were 6 or 7 I think I've heard you talk about over the years, but there were 3 big ones that you wanted to focus on from a little bit of a different perspective, maybe an unusual perspective. What is that third one?
I want to talk about student excellence. All right. And again, we talked about people at the beginning of this podcast episode. We talked about people on the outside looking in and assumptions that people make about the results that come from group lessons. And I think if a lot of teachers were to be honest, they would guess that group lessons would create substandard results. You get students that they're not paying a premium, they're not getting the teacher's one-on-one focus, and so the result is going to be things fall through the cracks, and students are going to have like a piecemeal education that's not held together so tight. I want to start with a small story. Again, way back when I was a young teacher, I was at a piano retail store, and I would go to these clinics where representatives from different retailers would come and talk about their pianos. This was a lady from Roland, and she was talking about the buttons you can push on this amazing Roland piano. There were some other things that she said I've mentioned in other parts of this podcast that changed my life. But one of the things that she said is she held up a Faber & Faber Primer level book. For those of you that know Piano Adventures, that's their purple book. And she said, this book here outsells the next book, which is their red level 1 book. She said, this purple book is going to outsell this red book 2-1. Okay. Now, I don't know where she got those stats, so I'm quoting someone else. Someone else, if you all want to go into Hal Leonard's sales and check those facts, that's fine. But
we need to have Randall Faber on the podcast. We need to get Randall on the podcast.
Are these numbers right? That would be amazing. But then. And then she held up the red book, and then the next book after that is their level 2A, which is a blue book. She said this red book is going to outsell the blue book 2-1. And so for every 4 students that start piano, only 1 is going to make it to what we as teachers consider to be late elementary, not even early intermediate. And I started thinking about when I heard her say that, I didn't have any way to check the sales facts, but I thought about my studio, like my door-to-door traveling routine. And sure enough, I was like, I think only about 1 out of 4 of my students are beyond blue books. And at the time I was using Piano Adventures books, so I knew those books well. And I was like, she's right. 75% of my life, I am just trying to convince students to care about lines and spaces and steady beats. 25% of my teaching life, I have an opportunity to maybe talk about eighth notes. And on a rare occasion, I might teach a sonatina. Okay. Before group lessons, that was how I spent my time. I want to say something that all music teachers are going to understand. To get good at a sonatina or a sonata, you have to practice, right? You can't play it without lots and lots of practice. I learned later in life that you can't teach a sonata well or a sonatina very well unless you practice teaching it over and over. You have to build that time into your life. After about 10 years of teaching, I finally had a handful of students that could play intermediate level music. And I put my students in their first competition here in Northern Virginia, in an NVMTA sonata competition. And I thought, these were my best students. I thought, hey, these kids are going to do great. They went to the sonata competition and just got destroyed by the competition, mowed down. I learned that year that there are some teachers here in Northern Virginia that just clean up. I think I joke with Daniel sometimes. I say that the students of these other teachers bring brooms to the competition because they sweep the floor. And I just couldn't believe the level of performance in some of these students here in my region. And I was just like, how do I start to raise the bar? How do I start to expect more out of my students in the area of excellence? Now, I want everyone to understand, I don't feel like every student should be in competitions. I do give all of my students choice. I don't think competitions are the right thing for every student. But for me, it was a little bit of a wake-up call. It's like, there is this bigger world out there. There is a way that I can be spending my time as a teacher and practicing as a teacher, rather than spending 75% of my time teaching quarter notes, half notes, lines and spaces. And when I went to group lessons, I grouped all of my students that needed to learn the difference between a line and a space into, one class format, right? Of course, we can't put them all in one giant 50-person class, but there is a class now that teaches that. and they learn together in groups, and that frees me up. It frees up my time, and I would say that now I spend the right proportion of time in my career, in my week, teaching lines and spaces, quarter notes, half notes. I have a lot of time now to study and practice myself with it more intermediate and advanced repertoire. And I'm getting a lot more practice every week, every month, every year, teaching repertoire. And fast forward to today, my students now, we do go to these competitions, and the grade teachers still have their brooms, they still sweep the floor, but my students, they're respectable. They can stand shoulder to shoulder. We squeak in a win every once in a while too. And so, I feel like me as a teacher in my studio, we've come a long way as far as raising the bar and raising the standard of excellence. And it wouldn't have been possible for me. I don't know how I would have done it if I hadn't incorporated group lessons into my teaching.
That's fascinating, Greg. I'm just like jotting down on my board, like the Brooklyn Music Factory equivalent of this and how we measure excellence, which is generally in the how many original songs are getting written and recorded every year. And I just sort of put this down and I was like, how would I group our younger set differently if I were thinking like you just said? It's just an awesome way to reconsider, and it's an awesome way to reframe this idea of your students' growth, because you're basically, what I hear you saying is you're looking for a much more efficient way to grow a larger capacity of students and get them to a space where you're then using your unique expertise, which is, as you said, like around teaching intermediate or advanced level material, and just you're actually allocating resources differently in a much wiser way. But with, we spent a bunch of this podcast talking about how to benefit the company and how to benefit the business, but you're actually now flipped it entirely to brings the greatest benefit to the student, because now they're getting me at the right time. They're getting the right resource at the right time. Because not all your teachers, you certainly don't have not every teacher at your school is qualified and prepared to teach intermediate piano material. So you want to allocate that resource in the right way to the right age group, in the right group, So it's just an awesome way to reframe it for our listeners.
I will say, just to add on to this, couldn't agree more. You cannot separate the result you get with a student from the environment in which you get that result. My experience has been that with giving more students time with me, and this was the thing that surprised me. So giving students more time with me or an instructor, huge. That's important. Going from half hour to an hour, you're literally doubling the time that child's in the studio. And I think curriculum plays a big part of that too. And we've talked long about why, I think certain group systems are much better than others. But something that I didn't expect when I personally adopted a group was that the balance of support and independence that kids have in a group structure versus a one-on-one structure actually changes the way the child learns. Within a one-on-one structure, those children are more likely to exhibit the signs of learned helplessness than they are in a structure that forces them to be more independent, and that directly leads to their long-term outcomes. And while I have not and did not enroll students in competitions, I did have them use the RCM program. And I think anyone who knows me knows I'm a huge believer in that RCM system. And I think there are other systems around the world that are equivalent, AMEB, ABSRM. I have a lot of respect for those systems because what they provide for a school owner or a teacher is an outside judge of, yes, the student's playing ability, but the results of your teaching. If you keep, I saw the first year I put kids in RCM, here's all these different children, and yet I have judges giving similar comments across 40 different kids, and like, oh, wait, if all of these kids are having a similar challenge or they're getting similar comments, the only common link between all of them is me. And it was interesting that first year, because then that next year that I was teaching kids, I took note of some of the things that were, quote, weaknesses in the kids, but they were actually weaknesses that I had put in them. Point being that I was able to get those weaknesses out in the context of the group structure, but more importantly, the overall level of the scores across the studio were high, even in this rigorous system. Which, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to turn this podcast into a commercial for RCM. I really and truly do love that system, but I do think it is far superior to most of the grading systems that exist across the United States. It's a little bit piecemeal. RCM has a much more consistent grading system across all their testing sites. Anyway, point being is that I saw the effects of that independence that it puts in even small children, 6 and 7-year-olds, and you just could not have gotten that in a one-on-one structure. Might have been a little bit long-winded, but it's really important to me, and I just thought I'd throw that in there too. That I definitely agree with this excellence thing.
Yeah, learned helplessness. I think those are words that I learned from you, Daniel. But it's the danger of being, I guess, a helicopter teacher, and finding the right balance where students get the help they need, but they're also encouraged to think for themselves. I mean, students learn math, science, history, soccer, taekwondo, swimming in group environments. And I think the only reason why the piano was never taught in a group environment traditionally is because the invention of headphones didn't come around until a lot later. But now that we have headphones, you can have students learning together in the same room. It is efficient. It frees a teacher up in their lifestyle so they can invest in themselves personally. You can manage a studio with a strong core staff. You can hold a high standard of excellence for your students. So those are some of the benefits that I have seen. I didn't know they were coming my way when I really decided to start moving forward with group lessons in my own studio, but I was surprised that some of these hidden benefits surfaced.
That's huge. And there might be another podcast out there to talk about specific, or we might have another episode in this to talk about specific things, because I think even in using group structures, there are limitations that people use in themselves, or that teachers or owners put on themselves in using certain group models, where they try to track all the kids together in a way that's overly cumbersome, like different levels of the same piece but being played at different levels. Like, I think there are ways that can help kids just absolutely rocket through those early years, but that's an entirely different topic.
Right. Yeah. Like, how exactly do you run a group lesson?
Yeah.
I have plenty to say about that, but yes, there's inherent problems with the way people traditionally try to do group lessons, and that's also something that has been my mission to try to solve. And I think in some ways I've seen some success there too. So if you're curious about that, we talk about grouplessons.com. My program, The Piano Express, is there. You can learn more.